When we imagine the ancient world, our minds usually cue up a very specific aesthetic. It's a world of gleaming white marble, inhabited by heroic figures staring nobly into the distance. We picture unstoppable Spartan warriors, displaying perfect discipline, the golden majesty of Byzantine emperors, supernatural vampire lords, and pious knights charging into battle. This version of history is an edited fiction. It prioritizes clean, dramatic narratives over the gritty, inconvenient details of actual life. Looking past the cinematic lighting reveals history as a collection of human solutions to impossible problems. It is the story of how people actually navigated their world, rather than how we wish they had. Take ancient Greece. Those pristine white statues were originally covered in vivid reds, blues, and golds. Over centuries, the elements stripped the pigment away, leaving a blank canvas that later generations mistook for an intentional choice of pure, uncolored perfection.
That illusion extends to how we view their society. We look at the ruins of the Acropolis and project a vision of an enlightened golden age, a place of rational citizens calmly debating the future. This chart shows the population of Athens at its democratic peak. The actual guest list for political participation was surprisingly specific. By removing women, foreign residents, and the massive enslaved population, the enlightened voting class shrinks to a tiny fraction of the people. Even their most famous thinkers were often viewed as public nuisances. Socrates spent his days exposing flaws in the arguments of experts and politicians, a habit that eventually led the state to put him on trial and sentence him to death by poison. The original Olympic Games followed a similar pattern of brutal reality. There were no weight classes or silver medals. The goal was simply to win. Corruption was frequent enough that the Greeks built bronze statues to publicly shame the athletes caught bribing officials. The achievements of ancient Greece are remarkable, specifically because they emerged from a society that was often violent, deeply unequal, and struggling with its own contradictions. By the Middle Ages, the scale of the illusion became physical. Travelers described Constantinople as a city of unimaginable wealth, with crowded harbors and golden church domes. The Hagia Sophia stood as the pinnacle of this visible majesty. Its massive dome projected a sense of imperial power and divine favor to everyone on the surface. However, providing water to 500,000 people on a besieged peninsula created an engineering crisis that marble palaces couldn't solve. To survive, the Byzantines had to dig deep into the earth. This is the Basilica Cistern, a massive underground reservoir supported by hundreds of columns, recycled from ruined Roman temples. Builders gathered discarded pagan monuments and dragged them into the dark to serve as functional infrastructure. Over centuries, the city above shifted and rebuilt, and these subterranean systems were eventually forgotten. People lived their entire lives directly over massive flooded chambers, unaware of the silent world beneath their feet. While the marble halls projected authority to the outside world, this damp utilitarian infrastructure, buried in the dark, actually kept the empire from collapsing. Our modern myths also flatten complex human trauma. We know Vlad Dracula as a supernatural monster, but his historical reality is grounded in the brutal geopolitics of the 15th century. Surrendered as a child hostage to the Ottoman Empire, Vlad was raised under strict military supervision, while his father and older brother were murdered by political rivals at home. He returned to his throne as a man shaped by isolation and the violent instability of the frontier. The heroes of the era, like the Teutonic Knights, lived under equally extreme institutional pressures. The romanticized image of the independent holy warrior disappears under the reality of their strict religious code. Inside fortresses like Malbork Castle, a knight surrendered his personal wealth, family ambitions, and marriage prospects. He lived a life of absolute obedience, where every hour was regulated by prayer, work, and military drills. A Baltic campaign meant months of slogging through freezing swamps and dense forests. When they weren't fighting, these knights were occupied, with the endless administrative grind of counting grain and managing provincial ledgers. The trauma of hostage life and the relentless grind of the frontier created these figures. They are the human result of extreme institutional pressures and unforgiving environments. When we peel back the Hollywood facade, we find faded statues, forgotten underground tunnels, traumatized hostages, and knights struggling through the mud. The danger of the cinematic myth is that it turns our ancestors into one-dimensional caricatures. It makes their historical struggles seem effortless and disconnected from our own complicated lives. Acknowledging the hypocrisy, the labor, and the agony of the past makes these civilizations more impressive. They achieved their breakthroughs while dealing with the same human limitations and messy realities that we face today. History is not remarkable because it is a polished superhero movie. It is remarkable because it is entirely, messily human. You have just marched 20 miles carrying 70 pounds of equipment. Your shoulders ache, dust coats your armor, and the sun is finally setting. You want food and you want rest. But as a Roman legionary, both of those things are forbidden until the heavy labor begins. Looking at this plan of a Roman consular camp, you can see the precise measurements required for the outer perimeter. Before any soldier was permitted to touch their rations, they had to dig a defensive trench and use the excavated earth to build the rampart. An entire fortified city had to be constructed from scratch every single night. The interior followed a rigid, identical grid, ensuring that exhausted men were never caught defenseless. Only when the walls stood complete did the 8 men of a standard tent group unpack their gear. They received raw wheat, not baked loaves. For the next arduous hour, the weary soldiers sat together turning heavy stones to grind that grain into flour. The repetitive labor of preparing a simple porridge bonded these men through shared effort. Roman military superiority relied on this ritual of physical deprivation. By forcing soldiers to construct fortresses and grind food at their limits of endurance, commanders built a collective resilience that held the army together long after their enemies had tired. The Romans accepted these brutal conditions as a requirement of the campaign trail. Hundreds of miles away, the citizens of Sparta embedded physical suffering into the permanent fabric of their daily domestic lives. Spartan education, known as the agoge, intentionally underfed young boys. The state determined that a child who learned to function while hungry would adapt to the severe realities of adult warfare. Instructors even encouraged them to steal food, punishing them only if they lacked the stealth to avoid getting caught. This contempt for comfort carried into adulthood. The centerpiece of their diet was a thick stew made from pork blood, salt, and vinegar. It was designed as nutritional fuel. Foreign visitors often remarked that after tasting it, they understood why Spartans were so willing to die in battle. Every adult male citizen was required to eat this exact same meal every night. By forcing men to share identical portions, the state removed the visible markers of wealth. A rich man and a poor man chewed the same coarse bread and drank the same diluted wine. This system of shared deprivation served to standardize the citizen experience. By actively training their population to tolerate hunger, Spartan leaders ensured that the transition from home life to the brutal realities of a battlefield was almost invisible to the men. So, what happens when a society masters its environment and basic survival is no longer a daily struggle? In the capital of the Roman Empire, physical endurance evolved into a performance. If you occupied the prestigious front row of the Colosseum, you sat terrified by unpredictable predators. Only a low wall separated the empire's wealthiest citizens from an arena floor where large cats and armed gladiators routinely clashed. Modern stadium designers place a premium on spectator safety. The ancient Romans ignored it. A senator could easily afford a secure seat high above the sand, yet they actively competed to sit exactly where the risk of collateral violence was highest. This cross-section shows how the Colosseum functioned as a map of Roman society. As you move from the highest tiers down to the arena floor, physical safety decreases while social power increases. The closer you were to lethal danger, the more important you appeared to the 50,000 people watching behind you. The emperors followed this same logic. The imperial box occupied the most exposed position possible. Some rulers, like Commodus, even bypassed the seating entirely to fight in the sand themselves, using proximity to death to validate their right to command. In Rome, status required visibility. A senator who sat calmly while a predator roared a few feet away sent a powerful message to the crowd. They accepted the physical risk because, in their world, appearing untouchable was a more effective political tool than being safe. Yet the Spartan warrior falls in battle, the Roman senator succumbs to age, and their empires eventually fracture. Physical endurance and social dominance both possess an expiration date. The ancient Celtic world offered a different solution to mortality. Societies without written archives relied on a human library to carry their history, law, and identity. They relied on the bard. While the Roman legionary trained his body to march, the bard trained his mind to remember. Becoming a master poet required decades of relentless study. They held thousands of verses, family lineages, and political treaties entirely within their memories. This mental endurance granted them political leverage. A king's authority often rested on his ancestry. A skilled bard could place that ruler into the permanent memory of their people through a eulogy, or destroy a family's reputation with a publicly delivered satire. From the trenches of a legionary camp to the precise memories of a Celtic poet, the ancient world utilized ritualized suffering to forge durability. These cultures accepted the immediate pain of discipline because they understood that power, status, and legacy lasted only as long as the endurance required to build them.
We tend to imagine a highlight reel. We see massive armies charging across open fields, emperors redrawing maps of the world, and solemn men in powdered wigs signing documents that create new nations. This bird's-eye view makes for great cinema, but it obscures the reality of how empires functioned. Kingdoms lived and died based on the stability of grain silos, the balance of tax ledgers, and whether or not the local mercenaries felt like staying the night. History's actual gears turned through ledger books, communal ovens, and dawn inspections of broken fences. By looking past the dramatic armor and the famous speeches, we can finally see the ordinary daily realities that drove the greatest engines of human history. Consider the Crusader military orders. For centuries, the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller were revered as legendary warrior monks, men who somehow convinced medieval Europe that taking vows of poverty while living in enormous castles and wearing heavily polished armor was a perfectly sensible career choice. This financial network was the Templars' power source. They pioneered international banking, allowing pilgrims to deposit gold in France and withdraw it in the Levant. That accounting generated massive wealth, but those deep pockets attracted indebted monarchs who used secret trials to wipe out creditors. The Templars disappeared in fire and scandal, destroyed by the political consequences of their own financial success. Yet their greatest rivals, the Knights Hospitaller, outlived them by centuries. The Hospitallers had constructed enormous fortresses like Crac de Chevaliers, managing complex logistics to feed and supply standing armies. But when they eventually lost their castles and territories, they didn't dissolve. They simply fell back on the mundane routine that had inspired their foundation in the first place, providing charitable medical care to the sick. While the Templars were consumed by the bureaucracy they built, the Hospitallers adapted. They traded battlefields for hospital wards, proving that a daily routine of charity remained globally relevant long after armored knights had become obsolete. Holding the largest contiguous land empire in history demanded sophisticated social rules and strict hospitality, especially on the isolated, unforgiving steppe. For a Mongol family, the daily rhythm revolved around their herds.
Transforming fresh mare's milk into a fermented drink called kumis required constant, collective effort. The milk was poured into a leather bag, and almost everyone who walked past the churn throughout the day was expected to give it a few vigorous strokes to keep the fermentation active. When a stranger appeared on the horizon, the very first thing placed into their hands was a wooden bowl of that kumis. Offering and accepting this drink was a vital act of diplomacy. It transformed isolated travelers into guests, sealed political alliances, and ensured that news traveled safely across thousands of miles of open grass. A similar reliance on communal routines existed within the Ottoman Empire. While the Sultan ruled from the massive, distant complex of Topkapi Palace, the actual cohesion of the empire was maintained down in the narrow, crowded streets of its neighborhoods. These urban centers were remarkably diverse, with Muslims, Christians, and Jews frequently living side by side. What bound them together were shared rhythms. Dough prepared at home was carried to communal brick ovens. Apprentices, merchants, and local laborers all relied on the same street vendors for grilled meat or lentil soup, and evening dinners were social events where doors remained open to unexpected guests. For both the nomadic Mongols and the urban Ottomans, shared daily nourishment did the heavy lifting of statecraft. It maintained trust and unity across vast, diverse societies in ways that standing armies simply could not. We often struggle to see this mundane reality when we look at early America. History prefers to freeze the founding fathers inside grand oil paintings, looking solemn and philosophical, as if they spent every waking hour debating the mechanics of democracy. In reality, their mornings were consumed by logistics. George Washington was an early riser who often stepped outside before sunrise to inspect the thousands of acres surrounding Mount Vernon. He checked on crop yields, worried about sick horses, and cataloged exactly which wooden fences needed repairing. At Monticello, Thomas Jefferson relentlessly managed his own estate. His daily routine involved tracking weather patterns, experimenting with new vegetable seeds, tearing down and rebuilding the walls of his house to test architectural theories, and answering an endless mountain of personal correspondence. But there is a glaring paradox here. The enormous amount of free time required for these men to read history, write letters, and draft constitutions did not materialize out of thin air. This chart illustrates the hidden cost of that intellectual freedom. The sprawling estates that provided their wealth and leisure were entirely sustained by the forced labor of enslaved men, women, and children. They planted the crops, cooked the meals, built the fences, and performed the grueling daily chores that allowed the plantation owners to sit at their desks. The birth of American democracy was heavily subsidized by the unfree, invisible daily routines of the very people who were completely excluded from its founding documents. Today, the physical remnants of these eras are mostly silent. The Crusader castles are crumbling tourist curiosities. The great nomadic camps of the steppe have vanished, and the architects of American independence are frozen as marble statues. We look at those monuments and remember the epic treaties and sudden collapses, but those dramatic conclusions were just the final visible outcomes of decades of quiet, repetitive habits. When we strip away the armor, the crowns, and the grand mythology, we find human beings attempting to balance their ledgers, feed their neighbors, and manage the immediate demands of their daily lives. History is not forged solely on battlefields or inside throne rooms. The ordinary, dependable routine is the true, extraordinary engine of human legacy.
We usually view the ancient world through its most massive stone monuments. Our history books focus on the highlight reel, the pyramids, the sprawling empires, and the conquerors who carved their names into the landscape. This perspective exists because surviving records were almost exclusively produced by an educated male elite. A Roman senator writing a history of his age prioritized military campaigns and legal ceremonies over the daily survival of the people living in his own household. The objects required for that daily survival, woven cloth, plant fibers, and wool, were organic. They were never meant to survive for thousands of years. Unlike stone temples, these materials rotted away, leaving a silent void where the routines of half the population used to be. what happens to our perspective of the past when we look past the grand monuments and investigate how human beings actually managed the requirements of the day? The most accurate record of human history is found in these overlooked practicalities, rather than in the myths and monuments of the ruling class. Ancient thinkers developed elaborate theories to explain the female body without the benefit of biological science. Greek physicians popularized the theory of the wandering womb, claiming the uterus could drift through the torso and cause illness unless lured back into place with specific scents. Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder documented even more imaginative claims. He stated the mere presence of a menstruating woman possessed the power to dull steel blades, kill bees, and cause wine to sour in its barrels. While scholars debated these theories, women utilized practical knowledge passed down through generations. They managed their biology using the resources at hand, so they could continue the essential work of grinding grain, tending crops, and managing households. Since ancient linen and wool decomposed long ago, historians look for fleeting references tucked inside larger documents to reconstruct these routines. These fragments suggest that midwives possessed a sophisticated understanding of health, providing a practical continuity that abstract theories lacked. These women adapted to their physiology to ensure their daily work and participation in society continued, despite the lack of scientific understanding from the era's elite. The Viking Age produced its own set of biological myths centered on the berserker. Old Norse sagas describe warriors entering a terrifying state of excitement, howling like wolves and biting the wooden rims of their shields before a charge. Popular modern theories often suggest these warriors achieved this state by consuming hallucinogenic mushrooms like fly agaric, or toxic plants such as henbane. The actual effects of hallucinogenic plants cause severe nausea, dizziness, and disorientation, fatal conditions in chaotic combat. Instead, berserker rage likely resulted from psychological conditioning, triggering an extreme adrenaline response, increasing heart rate and suppressing pain to perform at absolute physical limits. The berserker represents the capacity of the human mind and body to unlock extreme physical states through belief and training without needing external substances. We often view the Roman legion as a mechanical, unstoppable force expanding an empire's borders. This image focuses on the rigid discipline and monumental scale of Roman military authority. This pageantry fades inside the barracks of a frontier fort. When the evening trumpet sounds and the armor is removed, the atmosphere shifts from military discipline to the domestic realities of the men stationed there. Soldiers lived in 8-man squads called contubernia. Their evenings were occupied with the mundane tasks of communal wheat porridge, gambling with bone dice, and complaining about the officers in charge. These men relied on the Roman postal system to stay connected to distant families. They wrote letters on thin wooden tablets that survived in the waterlogged soil. These letters reveal human concerns, birthday invitations, and requests for warm clothing on the cold frontiers. The personal bonds maintained through these shared meals and letters provided the emotional stability required to hold the empire's borders together. By the late Middle Ages, the knight and the jousting tournament became the ultimate symbols of noble status and individual glory. The spectacle of the lists was designed to showcase the knight's supposed dominance on the battlefield. However, technology was moving in a different direction. Beyond the tournament field, disciplined infantry formations and gunpowder artillery changed the practical requirements of warfare. Because early firearms could penetrate steel plate with minimal training, the elite knight class lost the monopoly on military power it had held for centuries. As their military role declined, knights leaned into ceremonial tournament pageantry. Armor evolved into highly decorative, impractical sporting costumes to maintain fading social prestige. This era of spectacle reached a tragic conclusion in 1559, when King Henry II of France was killed by a stray tournament splinter. The most magnificent era of jousting was a theatrical performance, preserving the image of the heroic warrior, while practical warfare had already moved on.
These stories are connected by a single thread: the ancient woman folding linen, the Viking triggering an adrenaline surge, the Roman grunt riding home, and the knight performing for a crowd. While we often focus on grand battles and epic myths, human survival has always depended on the ability of ordinary people to adapt to their circumstances. Understanding the past requires looking beyond the stone monuments to see the human labor and daily routines that actually shaped civilization. History continues because of the unrecorded resilience of people managing the constant realities of their daily lives.
Imagine stepping into the highest echelons of the medieval world. To be a Byzantine empress meant being surrounded by unimaginable wealth, draped in heavy silk robes, walking beneath ceilings shimmering with gold mosaics, and commanding the respect of an entire empire. Hundreds of miles away, the Celtic bard enjoyed a similarly revered status. We tend to picture them as beloved entertainers, striking the chords of a beautiful wooden harp beside a roaring fire, while kings and warriors listen in rapt attention. Those images are illusions. Beneath the gold crowns and the haunting melodies, these roles were high-stakes psychological endurance tests. In both Constantinople and the Celtic strongholds, reaching the absolute pinnacle of society required the complete surrender of personal freedom. For a young noblewoman, the path to the throne often began with a royal summons to the Byzantine bride show. It sounds like a fairy tale romance, but it operated as the most terrifying, hyper-political job interview on Earth. Imperial officials scrutinized every candidate for their direct political utility. They calculated whether a young woman's extended family would support the crown or cause future headaches and civil wars for the emperor. Meanwhile, the journey to becoming a master bard began around the age of 8. A child with a sharp memory would be separated from their family and sent far from home to live with a demanding master. There was no joyful singing or strumming of harps in those early years. The education was grueling, relying entirely on the rote memorization of thousands of lines of genealogies, laws, and history. Whether it was a child taken from their village or a teenager summoned to the Great Palace, neither the bard nor the empress truly chose their path. They were drafted to serve the needs of their societies. Selection was merely the beginning. From that moment forward, their minds and bodies were repurposed as state institutions. Once inside the Great Palace of Constantinople, an empress quickly discovered that privacy did not exist. Every conversation and action was monitored by ambitious eunuchs, rival noble families, and foreign spies looking for a weakness. This surveillance extended into grueling public ceremonies. A single incorrect facial expression, or standing in the wrong place during a procession, it could trigger a massive political crisis. The bard faced the same crushing scrutiny. During recitations, older masters watched them like hawks, waiting to penalize a single mispronounced syllable or forgotten name. Because Celtic culture relied heavily on oral tradition, bards had to construct a massive cognitive architecture, a mental library. They built a vast network of nodes linking stories, families, and laws together to store immense data. The pressure was immense. One dropped link in that mental web, one misstated treaty, could invalidate a king's claim to his throne. External instability made perfection the only safe option. Because the Byzantine emperor was considered God's chosen ruler, an empress favoring the wrong religious faction was branded an enemy of the state. Similarly, a bard who refused to commit to a tribal alliance lost the social protection of his title, often finding himself treated as a wandering spy. They were required to operate flawlessly, day after day, in thoroughly hostile environments, where everyone around them was actively waiting for them to fail. When an empress lost favor, the penalties were catastrophic. A sudden palace coup could result in forced blinding, violent death, or being shipped off to spend the rest of her life locked inside a remote monastery. For a bard, failing the final examination meant returning to society in disgrace,
with a wasted youth. And once in power, a poorly judged poem or a misplaced insult could snap a delicate alliance and spark actual tribal warfare. Decades spent carefully accumulating power, memorizing histories, and building alliances could vanish overnight, entirely undone by a single whispered rumor. This constant looming threat of destruction was the exact mechanism these societies used to control the people who held their most potent political weapons. Surviving the surveillance, the rivals, and the terrifying threat of ruin yielded a power capable of shaping civilizations. A master bard operated as the Iron Age's public relations department. They wielded satire with such precision that they could socially destroy a ruler, forcing kings to treat them with extreme caution. A master empress possessed unparalleled defensive power. They acted as regents for young heirs, dictated state religious policies, and stared down violent citywide riots to keep dying dynasties from collapsing. Some women navigated this maze so successfully they ruled the empire alone. These figures stood as the load-bearing pillars of their entire cultures. If they broke under the pressure, society itself fractured. Achieving peak influence in the ancient world required surviving a superhuman psychological gauntlet. To gain the world, you first had to survive it.
When we picture the past, we usually imagine sweeping cinematic epics. We picture flawless romantic tragedies, fearless warriors trading meaningful glances across crowded feast halls, and unified empires building pristine monuments. The reality of human existence, however, involves a lot more paperwork, bad weather, and terrible communication. If you look closely at the historical record, the illusion of grand destiny quickly shatters. The defining moments of antiquity were rarely driven by poetic fate or divine design. They were usually the result of leaders trying to solve immediate, messy, everyday problems. To actually understand the ancient world, we have to look past the mythology and focus on the mechanics. We need to examine the physical infrastructure, the supply lines, and the inevitable human errors that dictated how people lived and died. Investigating the messy, practical side of these stories changes how we see the past. It reveals that the challenges faced by ancient queens, Viking merchants, and frontier soldiers are far more recognizable than the myths suggest. Take the summer of 30 BC. The Roman leader Octavian had a very specific logistical goal in Egypt. He wanted to capture Queen Cleopatra alive. In Rome, victorious generals cemented political power through massive public parades. Octavian needed Cleopatra as his ultimate living trophy to secure his public relations triumph. This diagram illustrates Cleopatra's counter-strategy. Recognizing Octavian's ambition, she began moving all of Egypt's wealth, gold, silver, and jewels, into a heavily fortified mausoleum, and then locked herself inside with it. She effectively created an ancient panic room, threatening to burn the treasury to ashes if Octavian tried to take her by force. This high-stakes standoff was entirely undone by the fatal flaw of ancient communication networks, the inability to instantly verify facts. With Cleopatra sealed securely behind heavy doors, a rumor began circulating through Alexandria that the queen was dead. That unverified rumor eventually reached her political and romantic ally, Mark Antony. Instead of sending a messenger to confirm the story or investigating the claim, the celebrated Roman commander accepted it as absolute fact. He immediately attempted to take his own life, but bungled the attempt, leaving himself severely wounded but still very much alive. When Antony finally learned that Cleopatra was safely inside her vault, he asked to see her. Cleopatra refused to unlock the doors and expose herself to Octavian's soldiers. So one of the most famous military commanders in the Mediterranean had to be hoisted up the side of the building and hauled through a second-story window using an emergency rope pulley system. The final hours of the 300-year Ptolemaic dynasty came down to a combination of locked doors and bad timing. It was a failure in basic communication and physical logistics. We project a different kind of romance onto the Vikings.
Modern pop culture just loves the idea of fierce Scandinavian warriors swept up in passionate, dramatic love affairs. In reality, a Viking marriage was a highly calculated corporate contract. The groom's family paid a munder, or bride price, while the bride brought a dowry of livestock, land rights, or silver. Together, this was the seed capital required to launch a new agricultural business in an incredibly harsh climate. Because surviving the Scandinavian winter required flawless execution, Viking women effectively operated as chief operating officers. They managed the food supplies, directed the farm workers, and oversaw complex operations like textile production, which required hundreds of hours of highly organized industrial labor. Holding this much economic responsibility granted Norse women explicit legal rights that were extremely rare in medieval Europe. A married woman physically carried the keys to the household storage rooms and vaults, proving her absolute control over the family's assets. If the partnership failed, she held the legal right to declare a divorce and divide the property. Viking society maintained its stability through these legally binding, deeply pragmatic mergers. Passion and warrior honor were entirely secondary to the actual goal, ensuring the household had enough resources to survive until spring. Perhaps no historical structure is buried under more mythology than the Great Wall of China. We are taught that a single emperor commanded a unified, continuous stone barrier across the country, one so massive it can be seen from space. This diagram demonstrates the physics of orbital optics. From space, human visibility depends entirely on the width of an object, not its length. Though stretching for thousands of miles, its narrow width completely vanishes against the massive geographic background. This timeline map reveals it is not a single structure, but a fragmented series of distinct walls, built, abandoned, and rebuilt by different dynasties over 2,000 years. The staggering human cost of this project is preserved in local folklore. The famous legend of Mengjiangnu, a woman whose tears of grief supposedly caused a section of the wall to collapse, revealing her dead husband's remains, isn't a literal account. It is cultural evidence of the forced labor and brutal casualties required to physically move millions of tons of earth and stone without machinery. For soldiers stationed there, the Great Wall was an assignment defined by extreme isolation. They spent years staring at empty horizons from remote mountain ridges, dealing with freezing winters, irregular supply deliveries, and the endless, grueling work of repairing masonry damaged by the weather. The structure we see today reflects generations of grueling labor and the constant logistical strain of maintaining thousands of miles of isolated fortifications. If the reality of the ancient world is so complex and deeply human, why do societies consistently insist on rewriting it into streamlined, magical legends? Often, those myths are intentional cover-ups. Octavian needed to explain why a Roman general had defected and why the war in Egypt had been so difficult. He wrote a new story for the public, framing Cleopatra as a mystical seductress who had corrupted Antony and distracted him from his duties. Subsequent generations continue the cycle. We strip away the boring economics, the mundane infrastructure, and the human resources issues, because destiny and romance are much easier to sell than contract law, communication breakdowns, and construction delays. Stripping away the legend reveals a history that feels much more familiar. These events were driven by people making choices in real time, dealing with broken supply lines and bad information, while trying to manage a world they didn't fully control.
We tend to view the ancient world as a rigid, unforgiving place. The assumption is that early societies demanded strict conformity, and anyone whose mind worked a little differently was quickly pushed to the margins. The reality is that the human gene pool has remained remarkably consistent for thousands of years. The exact same variety of temperaments, fixations, and neurological profiles that exist today were walking around medieval villages and ancient cities. They just lacked our modern medical vocabulary. So, if a young person possessed an intense, obsessive focus or an extremely low tolerance for social interaction, how did they survive without modern psychology, developmental checklists, or career counseling? They survived because those rigid societies actually operated as complex ecosystems.
They contained specialized niches that absorbed different types of minds and channeled their unique traits into the foundations of civilization. Imagine living in a medieval village of 300 people. Privacy did not exist. If a child rarely spoke, avoided eye contact, or spent hours compulsively organizing tools by size, the entire community noticed immediately. But medieval society often prioritized utility over conformity. A person fascinated by patterns and repetition might be apprenticed to a master builder. The intricate geometry of a cathedral entrance required thousands of identical, perfect repetitions. A mind that thrived on obsessive detail could find social prestige in the craft guilds. For those who found the chaos of a busy market overwhelming, there was an even more structured environment, the monastery. It offered a life governed by ringing bells, fixed meal times, and a daily cycle that rarely changed from year to year. A desire to sit alone in silence for hours was rarely treated as a social defect. In the Middle Ages, it was widely respected as a sign of deep spiritual devotion. This open manuscript shows dense, handwritten text. Reproducing this took months of manual copying, where every letter had to be perfect. On the right, a gold-framed illustration is rendered with microscopic precision. For a specific type of mind, this endless, silent concentration was deeply satisfying. The medieval monastery provided a sanctuary where these traits were protected, turning what we might now call neurodivergence into an essential tool for safeguarding the records of the past. Other temperaments required entirely different environments. If you were born with an appetite for massive risk and boundless ambition, the agricultural hierarchy offered you very little. European nobility was a closed loop, determined almost entirely by inherited land. To find an outlet, individuals turned to maritime trade hubs. In ancient Carthage, social status was tied to profitable results rather than an aristocratic bloodline.
Centuries later, merchants like Marco Polo leveraged that same commercial mindset. By venturing into the vast, unknown trading networks of the Mongol Empire, Polo bypassed the traditional European hierarchies completely. This chart compares two distinct financial paths in the Middle Ages. Landed estates produced a predictable, linear income based on annual harvests. Maritime trade was volatile, but it offered exponential returns that could accumulate in a single lifetime. Global trade networks served as a specialized niche. They absorbed the restless and the ambitious, allowing merchants with liquid wealth to rival the long-established power of kings. Sometimes a society needed to absorb thousands of young men who simply lacked direction. The Roman legion took scattered individuals, stripped away their civilian habits, and locked them together into a single disciplined unit. The entire system was overseen by a central authority that demanded discipline. Personal heroics were actively discouraged. Survival depended entirely on maintaining formation. The daily routine of a Roman soldier was famously repetitive. After marching for hours carrying heavy equipment, they were required to dig trenches and construct a fortified camp using the exact same layout, regardless of the terrain. This map shows the provinces of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. Maintaining borders that stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Britain required a logistical machine built on relentless, unwavering repetition. Through shared exhaustion, men from vastly different backgrounds gained a collective identity. Look at the figures in this carving. Individual features vanish behind identical helmets and shields, giving every man a tangible place in a massive hierarchy. For those seeking order in an unpredictable world, the Roman military provided a rigid framework that organized individual effort into imperial power. When we look at the monuments of the past, we aren't looking at the work of a single, uniform type of person. Civilization was built by the hyper-focused, the ambitious, and the disciplined, all finding the roles that required their specific abilities. We invented the modern clinical language to describe human cognition. We created the terms for neurodiversity, risk tolerance, and executive function. But the minds themselves have been here all along. Historical success resulted from matching distinct temperaments to the specific environments that leverage their inherent nature.
History suggests that finding your purpose depends on locating the niche where your specific traits become indispensable assets.
To survive in the pre-modern world meant accepting that practically everything was out of your control. A sudden plague could wipe out your workforce. A harsh storm could erase a year's harvest in an afternoon. And shifting borders could turn your home into a battlefield without warning. But the human brain absolutely hates that kind of unscripted chaos. When we are faced with terrifying unpredictability, our instinct is to invent almost any logical narrative we can to force reality to make sense. To endure a world where disaster could strike at any moment, our ancestors engineered brilliant, complex systems of certainty. They built structural scaffolding to hold the chaos back. You can see the survival mechanism operating at every level of society. It starts inward, with the psychological coping mechanisms rulers use to excuse their political failures. It expands outward to the strict, brutal vows of medieval military orders. And it scales all the way up to massive societal safety nets disguised as imperial marriages. For a medieval monarch, stability was almost impossible to maintain. Governing meant constantly juggling sudden rebellions, broken alliances, and relatives plotting to steal your territory. It was highly unpredictable and deeply dangerous. So powerful men desperately fought to possess objects that promised absolute certainty. This is the Iron Crown of Lombardy, heavily decorated in gold and enamel. Kings chased it because it represented divine approval. According to tradition, the thin iron band running inside it was forged from a crucifixion nail. But heaven rarely provided customer support. When ambitious rulers, like the descendants of Charlemagne, claimed the crown and split up massive empires among their heirs, they immediately faced civil wars and catastrophic fragmentation. The exact same pattern followed the Spear of Destiny. This sacred relic, seen here with a gold casing wrapped around its fractured iron blade, supposedly guaranteed absolute victory in battle. Yet the rulers who carried it still suffered crushing defeats and died in violent rebellions. When a king lost half his territory, admitting to poor logistical planning or sheer incompetence was embarrassing. Blaming a cursed supernatural object was an elegant solution. Chroniclers and storytellers readily adopted the curse narrative to explain why powerful men kept failing. A cursed artifact provides a highly effective psychological tool. By pointing to a haunted crown or a doomed spear, a ruler created a concrete external scapegoat for human error. It protected their ego and maintained the comforting illusion that the world still operated by a strict set of rules. Move away from the royal courts and into the Crusader states, and that demand for control intensifies. Out on the frontier, European forces faced extreme geographic isolation and the constant daily threat of military collapse. To survive in that environment, an organization known as the Knights Templar attempted to impose strict institutional order. You can see the formidable, heavy stone exterior of their temple church in London, reflecting the absolute rigidity they brought to warfare. Standard medieval armies had a fatal vulnerability: the knights themselves. Individual nobles were notoriously unreliable, frequently making erratic choices driven by personal wealth, family politics, and fragile egos. The Templars engineered a radical solution to strip away that unpredictability.
First, they required a strict vow of poverty. A new recruit had to surrender all of his personal property, horses, and wealth to the order, instantly erasing individual financial ambition. Next came the vow of obedience. This removed a knight's personal autonomy entirely. He could not travel, choose where to live, or make tactical decisions without permission. Instant compliance to the chain of command was mandatory, preventing chaotic behavior on the battlefield. Finally, they enforced a vow of chastity. By forbidding marriage and children, the order actively severed family bloodlines. A knight defending a remote desert fortress would never have his loyalties divided between holding the walls and protecting a wife or heir back home. These extreme vows are often viewed strictly as acts of religious devotion. In reality, they functioned as an advanced military technology.
The Templars systematically dismantled the chaotic, selfish individual to build a highly reliable, unified institutional machine. That drive to engineer stability eventually scales all the way up to society itself. Look at the complex, bustling urban centers of the Ottoman Empire, where millions of people navigated commerce, politics, and daily survival. Today, we expect marriage to be a spontaneous romance. But for Ottoman citizens, marriage operated as a highly structured, risk-mitigating negotiation between two extended households. This flowchart shows exactly how they handled the mahr, or bridal gift. Notice that the wealth completely bypasses the groom and the bride's father. It flows directly to the woman, forming a legally binding financial asset that belongs exclusively to her. By locking in that contract, the families engineered a hard layer of financial predictability. The gold coins worn on this bride's headpiece symbolize that portable security. If the marriage ended in sudden divorce, or she became a widow, she was financially protected against the fallout. Once the legal contract was signed, the surrounding community ratified the agreement by celebrating with a massive wedding feast. Families served enormous quantities of pilaf, rich, slow-cooked stews, and towering trays of baklava. These hosts deliberately prepared far more food than they needed, specifically to feed uninvited neighbors, travelers, and strangers. This was a highly calculated display of generosity designed to weave an unbreakable safety net of communal goodwill. An Ottoman wedding was an intricate societal mechanism. It took a private union and turned it into a public institution, successfully distributing wealth, ensuring legal accountability, and binding an entire community together to weather future hardships. At first glance, a cursed royal jewel, a celibate knight's vow, and a massive tray of wedding baklava appear to have absolutely nothing in common. Yet they act as the exact same technology. They are meticulously designed tools that humanity built to construct scaffolding against the terrifying unpredictability of existence. We still do this today. We invent convenient narratives to excuse our professional failures. We rely on rigid institutional rules to feel a sense of safety at work. And we use elaborate public rituals to bind our communities together. The chaos of the world never truly goes away, and neither does our drive to engineer order out of it. We often view the ancient world through a gallery of pristine marble statues, a single, orderly empire of white stone. But that clean image shatters the moment you look at the people living beneath it. Antiquity wasn't a monolith. It was a fragile ecosystem of distinct social structures, each fighting its own specific battle just to endure. In this world, survival was a tiered struggle. It meant maintaining personal honor in a rigged system, protecting a village against the physical whims of nature, and guarding centuries of tradition without the help of a single book. To understand how these societies functioned, we have to examine the three pillars that held them up: the individual, the community, and the mind, and see what happened when they were finally tested by the weight of time. For the individual, the most visceral test was the Roman arena. Gladiators occupied a strange paradox. Legally, they were property, men with no rights and no future. Yet, through combat, they could achieve a level of fame that turned them into cultural icons. Consider the fighter named Flamma. Over a career spanning decades, he survived 34 matches, an incredible feat in a profession where many never saw their third. 4 separate times he was offered the wooden sword, symbolizing his freedom. 4 times he declined it. Historians still debate that decision. In the arena, Flamma was a decorated celebrity with a documented record of victory. In the civilian world, he would have been an aging former slave with no trade but violence. For a man like him, the arena provided a status and a livelihood that the outside world could not guarantee. This fame outlived the fighters themselves. In the ruins of Pompeii, graffiti still marks the walls, calling gladiators the darling of the girls. Their identities were so powerful that they remained etched into the city's stone long after the men were gone. For the gladiator, survival wasn't just about breathing. It was about seizing personal agency within a state-sponsored system designed to use them as disposable entertainment. Far from the grand arenas, survival moved to a larger scale. In the forests of pre-Roman Gaul, life was defined not by individual glory, but by the community's relationship with the earth. Every Gallic village was a self-contained world. Daily life followed a relentless rhythm, tending the central hearth, herding their livestock, and maintaining the wooden palisades that kept rival raiders at bay. Survival here required brutal manual labor. They used iron sickles and wooden plows to scratch a living from the soil, growing the grains that kept the village fed. A single bad harvest or a late frost didn't just mean a lean year, it meant the very real possibility of starvation. Because their entire focus was on the survival of their own fields and flocks, these communities remained intensely local. They were built to defend against a neighboring tribe, not a distant empire. This local focus was their strength for generations, but it became their greatest weakness. When Rome arrived with professional legions and supply lines that crossed continents, these isolated villages found themselves unable to coordinate a defense against a machine that operated on a scale they could barely imagine. In ancient Ireland, survival shifted to a third scale, the preservation of the mind. This was the domain of the Druids. Druids were the intellectual foundation of society, serving as judges, historians, and spiritual intermediaries. They held the community together by ensuring that the laws and traditions of the past were never forgotten. Training for this role could take 20 years. Without books, a student had to commit every tribal law, every family genealogy, and every sacred ritual to memory, perfecting the rhythmic verses that made such vast amounts of information stick. This total reliance on oral tradition meant that a Druid's brain was essentially a human library. They kept an entire civilization's identity alive simply by repeating it, ensuring that their culture could survive even without a written language. For the Druids, survival meant the flawless transmission of memory. Their power was absolute so long as the spoken word remained the only way to carry the past into the future. No matter how fiercely these people fought, individually, communally, or intellectually, none of these systems could withstand the slow turning of history. The gladiators' world faded as public morality changed and the empire grew too poor to host the games. The Gallic village was eventually reorganized into a Roman province, its independent farms absorbed into the machinery of imperial trade. In Ireland, the Druids saw their influence dissolve with the arrival of Christian monks. These newcomers brought a change that the Druids could not compete with: the written word.
Once laws and stories were recorded in ink on parchment, the need for a living human library began to disappear. There is a final irony in these stories. We remember the gladiators' honor, the Gauls' communal toil, and the Druids' sacred memory, because the very institutions that replaced them ultimately decided to write their stories down. We have all seen the image, the shining knight effortlessly charging into battle, the king presiding over a raucous, overflowing feast, the visionary emperor commanding impossible cathedrals to rise from the dust. It looks like a life of innate, unchallenged dominance. But this image is a carefully constructed historical lie, engineered by the people who benefited from it most. Holding absolute power in the pre-modern world did not mean going on heroic adventures. It meant decades of strict discipline, tedious administrative labor, and highly calculated public performances. If you wanted to rule, your entire existence was an exhausting, highly engineered theatrical production. The training of a medieval knight began at age 7, and it had very little to do with swords. As a page, a young noble endured strict behavioral discipline, memorizing complex family histories and mastering etiquette. Improper spoon management at dinner could damage an entire family's political reputation. By 14, the boy became a squire. He didn't ride gloriously into battle. He served as a heavily burdened pack mule for a veteran warrior. He woke before sunrise to scrub rust off metal, polish weapons, and haul heavy equipment across miles of muddy countryside. Looking at this full suit of plate armor reveals the barrier to entry. The steel, the joints, the custom fitting,
This equipment alone cost a fortune. A single knight wearing this into the field carried more wealth on his body than an entire peasant family would earn in years. Once a knight finally acquired land, his days filled with administration. He inspected crops, collected rents, and sat in local courts to settle endless peasant disputes over property boundaries or missing livestock. When war did arrive, the songs left out the reality. Campaigns meant weeks of slow marching in the rain, agonizing hours spent waiting in formation, and desperately trying to keep a supply chain intact so soldiers would not starve before seeing an enemy. Surviving the mud, managing the harvests, and keeping logistics running, not swinging a sword, was the actual foundation that kept elite military power functioning. That same demanding logic applied on an institutional scale. In the 6th century, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian needed to project absolute authority over hundreds of thousands of citizens, and he chose architecture as his medium. He ordered the construction of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. The goal was to build a structure so impossibly massive that any visiting merchant, any rival diplomat, or rebellious citizen standing inside would feel entirely insignificant. This image shows the immense interior space of Hagia Sophia. Justinian hired brilliant engineers to hide the massive weight-bearing structures, pushing arches outward so the central dome appeared suspended in midair. By placing a continuous ring of windows directly at the base of that dome, the engineers allowed sunlight to flood in and visually sever the heavy roof from the walls below. It created a glowing halo, convincing visitors they were looking at a miracle. The building also manipulated sound. The vast marble interior caught the chanting of the clergy and bounced it across the arches, transforming a single voice into a physical wave that rolled through the space, overwhelming the senses of anyone listening. Hagia Sophia operated as a carefully engineered psychological weapon. It demanded total submission to the empire before a single guard ever had to draw a weapon. Elites also weaponized social gatherings. Royal banquets were highly aggressive diplomatic battlefields. Seating arrangements, the spices used in the sauces, and who received the best cut of meat all communicated strict social hierarchy. In 1520, England's King Henry VIII met his French counterpart to demonstrate friendship. In reality, they engaged in a ruinous financial duel known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. King Francis I and Henry escalated the event into an absurd display of wealth. They built temporary palaces, erected gold-covered tents, and slaughtered thousands of animals for endless courses of food, entirely to intimidate each other. A century later, King Louis XIV evolved this concept at Versailles. He turned his evening meal into a mandatory public performance. This is the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, an example of the overwhelming spaces Louis created to host psychological games. The highest nobles in France were required to crowd into a room and stand for hours, watching the king eat as a spectator sport. A single glance from the king during these meals could elevate a career or destroy it. Weaponized dining neutralized the ruling class, keeping them desperate for favor and trapped in an expensive web of absolute control. Maintaining this level of supremacy demanded a heavy physical toll. After a lifetime of service, a veteran knight rarely retired to a life of ease. He was left with broken joints, old scars, and the bone-deep exhaustion of decades spent managing land and men. Beneath the colorful banners and gold embroidery, the reality of pre-modern tower was built on deep mud, endless spreadsheets of grain harvests, calculated acoustic illusions, and the rigid tension of forced theatrical dining. The greatest achievement of the historical elite was their ability to hide this grueling labor behind a flawless, impenetrable facade of divine right and innate superiority. The lasting legacy of these rulers rests on the sheer willpower required to engineer an illusion so convincing that we still believe it centuries later.